George Pell. We'll soon find out if he has one final chance to have his conviction for child sex offences overturned. Let's go to the High Court. And our reporter Annalise Nielsen standing by. Annalise, what grounds is he appealing for special leave?
Well, Kieran, this special leave application is on the basis that they say the onus was too much on the defence to prove that the scenario of which he was convicted was impossible, when it should have been up to the prosecution to prove beyond reasonable doubt. And so that's why this application has come to the High Court. Now, it's important to understand that appeal isn't being heard today. Today is just the decision on whether they will be allowed to hear that appeal in the High Court. And so that is very significant for the Pell legal team, because if they lose today, that's it. There are very few, very long shot options left for the Cardinal, but it seems almost unlikely that any of those will happen. More likely is that he'll serve out that full sentence for those child sex abuse convictions. That's at least 3 years and 8 months, but a maximum of 6 years in jail. Now, we do understand George Pell hasn't come up to Canberra for the hearing today. We understand he is still in the Melbourne Assessment Centre, where he is serving out his current sentence. That's because there's no new evidence being heard that he would have the right to know. These are all legal arguments that have been put forward. This hearing is happening any moment now. It will last about 30 seconds when the judges will say whether they are granting that special leave for appeal or not.
Yeah.
It's then that it would be next year, in a few months, that you would have that decision handed down and aired in court.
Yeah, as you say, 9:30 a.m. is the time, so any moment our correspondent in the court will send you that judgment. It is huge news that we're awaiting, and I think right around the world they're waiting to see the judgment here, because, Annalise, of course the Vatican has not defrocked the Cardinal at this point. They're awaiting all of the courses of appeal to be exhausted. This will basically be the last one. There's been some change to a law off the back of Lawyer X, that case in Melbourne, which could see a further appeal to a lower court, but only if there's fresh evidence, and that's a big if. On this particular ruling, it's the highest court of the land, and the judgment to be, you know, you'll be receiving that any moment now. So we'll bring that as soon as it happens, of course, Annalise. But as I say, this is something which we're watching, the Catholic Church is watching, not just here, but right around the world.
Absolutely. This has grabbed global attention because Cardinal Pell was such a senior Catholic. He was in charge of the finances, a personal confidant of the Pope, and for many years the most senior Catholic in Australia as well, which is a huge audience for the Catholic Church. So this has been something that has gained those international headlines and been watched very closely. These court cases went on in Melbourne for quite some time as well. The reporting was limited to give him the right for a fair trial in each of those instances. That he had 2 different allegations made against him, that those cases didn't prejudice each other, but it was very well known what was happening, and it was very important for Victoria in particular, where we saw that appeal not allowed. But on that case of fresh and compelling new evidence, it would be something quite extraordinary. They would have to have something like a confession from someone else, a new witness. It has to be completely different. Those laws do exist in South Australia, but they're only being debated now in Victoria because of the Lawyer X case, and it's something where there is a national discussion about whether those laws should be allowed, because at some point you do need the court decision to stand as it is. But if it was allowed, it would be an extraordinary case. More likely would be an appeal against the sentence, but even then George Pell has said that he won't be appealing his sentence. He said that he will accept that kind of suffering, but it is unlikely that he would be able to survive his position in the Catholic Church. If the appeal today is not allowed, that special leave application, he certainly would lose that cardinal status.
Yeah, indeed. And this special leave application, if it is rejected, if the convictions are upheld, as we mentioned earlier, the nation's most senior Catholic would obviously be defrocked by the Church, would lose the cardinal status, and would serve a minimum 3 years, 8 months in jail. The full term that he was sentenced to was 6 years. It was obviously a very strong dissenting judgment from one of those in the Melbourne court at that point, but that does not mean that there is a problem at law with the judgment necessarily, and this is what we're waiting to hear, because today is basically the High Court ruling on the written arguments submitted by both parties. There was not an oral appeal here, as you point out. This was a written application special leave application. So the High Court has been looking over those written submissions. If special leave is granted, then in March or April next year, the appeal would be forthcoming, a full appeal to the High Court at that point, and then we would see whether or not those convictions would be upheld. But if the special leave is not granted, George Pell heads back to the Melbourne Assessment Prison. Well, he's there now. In fact, he has not attended the court, so he will remain there and will serve out the full term as sentenced in that judgment. So, Annalise, as we say, we know right throughout this case from the very start, so many cameras from right around the world. The Catholic Church has been really very much fixated with this issue, given he is the most senior Catholic to be caught up in an issue which has plagued the Catholic Church over recent years and has been had such a devastating impact on that church. But you would think that the Vatican, that has been loyal to Cardinal Pell throughout this, would have no judgment. Pell's appeal has been granted. He's a breaking news. George Pell, his appeal, special leave application to the High Court has been granted. Our correspondent has just sent us this from the High Court. So that is huge news for George Pell. His hope remains. Annalise Nielsen, hope for George Pell as this special leave application has been granted by the High Court.
That's absolutely extraordinary, Kieran, that a lot of the experts were telling us that this was a very unlikely long shot scenario. So this is a huge win for Cardinal Pell's legal team. This is a different legal team that's taking this forward that represented him both in court and at the appeal. That's also quite standard, but they were told it was a very long shot that he would get this far. So this is going to be huge news for Cardinal Pell when he finds out he's still in the remand centre in Melbourne, as we've been saying, and it's something that is also very normal in this instance. And so what happens from here is that now this appeal leave has been granted. The hearing will happen most likely in March or April of next year. There will be about 3 months, and it's in that time that they'll receive written submissions, but then there will be oral submissions taken in the High Court as well. From there, he may have his conviction quashed, or there may be an order of a retrial, and that will be key going forward because both of those scenarios are equally likely. So this is something where the Catholic Church will now be on standby. It's unlikely he'll be defrocked in that time because they do want to let him have the full course of all those appeals. And so this is a huge development in this case. It was seen to be more likely that this was the last straw in the case.
Extraordinary developments, absolutely, in what has been an extraordinary case right throughout, Annalise. We know the verdict in August. There was, as we mentioned, that very strong dissenting judgment by Justice Mark Weinberg, but it was basically outnumbered in terms of that Court of Appeal with Justice Maxwell and Chief Justice Anne Ferguson convicting George Pell. But as you rightly point out, the High Court now, in its regular sitting weeks of 2 weeks per month, will give advance notice of the full appeal special leave being granted now, and we turn our attention to most likely March or April of next year, given there's normally a couple of months' notice once special leave is granted. It is nowhere near a majority of cases where this happens. It is quite rare, and as you rightly pointed out, most experts suggested it was unlikely because there needed to be a problem at law in the judgment. Obviously, the High Court has found something that they don't agree with or can't accept in terms of this judgment, at least in terms of the written submissions. Now they will see whether or not that is accepted in terms of the full appeal when it goes to the High Court in the first part of next year, Annalise.
So, Kieran, it's a pretty fine point of law here, but all that they've had to consider is whether there is an issue worth hearing. And so it does seem like they just think that there is a question to answer. It doesn't necessarily predict that the decision will go either way. And we're not going to get that information. The court doesn't release why they've decided to grant special leave for appeal in normal circumstances, is what we've been told by High Court experts. What we've been told is those will be ventilated when this hearing happens next year. We understand that it probably will last just a day or two. Even the appeal to the Supreme Court in Victoria only went for 2 days, and there was plenty of legal argument put forward. But this will be a huge onus for his team to try to prove why the conviction should be quashed, or there should be a retrial as well. Those are two of the options here, and so this is something where Cardinal Pell's team will be working frantically over the next few months. But it's certainly a huge glimmer of hope for the Cardinal as he's serving his time.
Oh, a huge glimmer of hope. Some hope in what has been a devastating period for him, having been convicted in August. And as you say, this does not give any indication as to what the High Court judgment will be, simply of the fact that they think that there is something to be heard. It'll be heard in front of 5 or potentially the 7 High Court justices. Will Pell be there? Probably not, according to the legal experts that I've seen this morning, suggesting that his role now is simply to instruct his lawyers. This will simply be a legal battle that won't involve him in person at least, and will most likely remain in the Melbourne Assessment Prison. But a glimmer of hope for Cardinal Pell. His legal team were shocked, I think it's fair to say, with the verdict in August. They felt that it was they felt that he was going to get off. He didn't. Now this case, which has really generated so much attention in this country and right around the world, goes one step further, and this will be in the first part of next year. We are guessing at this point, Annalise, that it would be in around March, April time, but either way, this is some hope for the 78-year-old Cardinal who was so close to the Pope. He was basically in the Pope's inner circle, in his cabinet as head of finance in the Vatican. I think really third in line behind the Pope Francis. So this is why this has been such a huge issue. Not just a big figure in the Catholic Church, but a huge figure in the global Roman Catholic Church, a third in line essentially to Pope Francis, a close confidant to him in his inner circle, and now one more glimmer of hope for him in terms of his legal battle. He's been granted special leave to appeal to the High Court.
And what's important to understand here is that he lost the appeal in the Supreme Court in Victoria. As you said, that one of those judges did dissent, and they said they weren't entirely convinced by the evidence of one of the victims. That won't come to bear on what's being discussed in the High Court. What's being discussed in the High Court is this ground of appeal that it was up to George Pell to prove that the scenario in which he's said to have abused these boys was impossible. They're saying that the onus of proof in a criminal case should be on the prosecution to prove beyond reasonable doubt that it happened, and that if they can cast enough doubt, that should have been enough to exonerate him. So that's going to be the question, whether that was what was put to the jury and whether that's what it was decided on. And so that's going to be really key for Cardinal Pell. But what this case has also done is highlighted so many of the issues that do come up in these historic child offence cases, that the evidence is a very long time past by the time it gets to court. We're looking at decades for many of these cases, and so you are relying on witness testimony, and it's up to the jury to decide how convincing that is. It's an awful burden to put on anyone to be discussing what's happened to children in these circumstances many years past and deciding whether that's true enough to convict a person of jail and of one of the most heinous offences in our society, or whether to let them go because it doesn't pass that standard. And so this has brought really around a discussion about how these cases are handled. We've seen so many child abuse cases come out of the Catholic Church, and it has become quite high profile, and that's what many of the defenders of George Pell have been saying, is that he's been caught up in the zeitgeist around this particular issue. But there certainly was enough evidence, at least, to convict him in the first instance, and that's something that's going to be something he bears for the rest of his life, whether he comes out of this or not, whether this appeal is successful.